I thought I knew what betrayal looked like until my husband stood up at his mother's 70th birthday party, wrapped his arm around a stunning redhead, and announced to our entire family that he wanted everyone to meet his, quote, real love. But when this woman's eyes met mine across the crowded dining room, her face went white as snow, and she bolted for the door like her life depended on it. What happened next would unravel 15 years of lies and reveal a truth so twisted that even I couldn't have imagined it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a dreary Saturday morning in November, just as I was wrestling with the coffee maker that had been acting up all week. Outside our cozy home in Millbrook Heights, the autumn leaves were falling in lazy spirals, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. How perfectly, blissfully normal. "Natasha, honey, you're still coming to Mom's party tonight, right?" David's voice crackled through my phone, slightly muffled like he was driving. My husband of 15 years sounded cheerful, maybe even excited in a way that should have been my first warning sign. "Of course," I replied, finally coaxing a decent cup of coffee from our temperamental machine. "I've been looking forward to it all week. Your mom's been planning this for months." David's mother, Evelyn Thornfield, was turning 70, and she'd insisted on hosting what she called a proper family celebration at her sprawling Victorian house on Maple Ridge Drive. The woman had a flair for the dramatic that her son had apparently inherited, though I'd never seen it manifest quite the way it would that evening. "Great! And hey, I'm bringing someone special I want everyone to meet," David said, his tone shifting to something I couldn't quite place. "Nervous? Excited?" "Someone really important to me." I paused, coffee mug halfway to my lips. In 15 years of marriage, David had never brought surprise guests to family gatherings without discussing it with me first. We were the type of couple who planned everything together, from grocery lists to vacation itineraries. It was one of the things I'd always loved about our relationship. We were a team. "Oh, who is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and curious rather than suspicious. "You'll see tonight, it's a surprise." He chuckled, but there was something underneath it that made my stomach twist slightly. "Trust me, Nat, this is going to change everything." Change everything. Those words would replay in my mind for hours afterward, each repetition adding another layer of unease. But at the time, sitting in our sunny kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and the smell of coffee warming the air, I chose to interpret it as excitement about some new friend, or maybe a work colleague he was particularly proud of. I spent the rest of the day in a pleasant haze of preparation. I picked up the specially ordered chocolate cake from Benedetti's Bakery downtown, Evelyn's favorite German chocolate with extra coconut frosting. I wrapped the vintage pearl earrings I'd found at an estate sale, the ones that would perfectly complement the antique jewelry collection she'd been building for decades. I even stopped by the florist on Riverside Avenue to grab a bouquet of her beloved white roses. Everything felt normal. Everything felt right. By 6 o'clock, I was dressed in my favorite navy dress, the one David always said brought out my eyes, and applying a final coat of lipstick in our bedroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was 38, comfortable in her own skin, with laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived and a marriage I'd always considered solid as granite. I had no idea I was looking at her for the last time. The drive to Evelyn's house took me through the historic district of Millbrook Heights, past the old courthouse and the park where David and I had gotten engaged 12 years earlier. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, with just enough chill in the air to make the warm glow spilling from house windows look extra inviting. Evelyn's Victorian was ablaze with light, and I could see family members milling around through the tall windows. Cars lined both sides of Maple Ridge Drive. David's brother Thomas had driven up from Riverside with his wife and kids. His sister Caroline had flown in from Portland, and it looked like most of the extended Thornfield clan had made the journey. I parked behind Thomas's familiar silver sedan and grabbed the cake, flowers, and gift from my back seat. The front porch was decorated with small pumpkins and autumn leaves, and I could hear laughter and conversation drifting out from inside. Everything about the scene screamed warmth, family, celebration. I should have known then that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. The front door was unlocked, as it always was during family gatherings, and I let myself in with the familiarity of someone who'd been part of this family for over a decade. The entryway smelled like Evelyn's signature pot roast and the vanilla candles she burned in every room. "Natasha, there you are!" Evelyn appeared from the kitchen, her silver hair perfectly styled and her cheeks flushed with happiness. At 70, she was still a striking woman, tall and elegant, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "David said you were bringing the cake. Oh, and those roses are gorgeous." She enveloped me in one of her warm, lavender-scented hugs, and for a moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of family, I felt that deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong. "Happy birthday, Evelyn," I said, handing over the flowers and gift. "70 looks amazing on you." She laughed, that rich, throaty sound that David had inherited. "Flatterer! Come on, everyone's in the dining room. David's been waiting for you. He has some sort of big announcement planned." My stomach did a small flip, but I smiled and followed her through the familiar hallways lined with family photos spanning decades. Photos that included me, woven into the fabric of the Thornfield family history. Wedding pictures, holiday celebrations, vacation snapshots, 15 years of shared memories captured in silver frames. I had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, every single one of those images would feel like evidence of a lie. The dining room was packed with familiar faces, all turned toward me with warm smiles as I entered. Thomas raised his beer in greeting, Caroline waved from where she was helping wrangle her toddler nephew, and various aunts, uncles, and cousins called out hellos. The long mahogany table was set with Evelyn's best china, and the room glowed with soft lamplight and the flicker of birthday candles. And there, at the head of the table, stood my husband David. He looked handsome in his charcoal gray sweater, his dark hair slightly mussed in the way that had made me fall in love with him all those years ago. But there was something different about his posture, something I couldn't quite identify. He seemed taller somehow, more confident, like a man about to make a declaration that would change the course of history. Next to him stood a woman I'd never seen before. She was beautiful in an almost ethereal way, tall and willowy with flowing auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire. Her skin was porcelain pale, and she wore a form-fitting emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Everything about her screamed elegance, sophistication, money. Everything about her screamed danger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence in the dining room stretched like a taut wire as David cleared his throat, his hand resting possessively on the mysterious woman's lower back. I stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of everyone's expectant stares pressing down on me like a physical force. "Everyone," David began, his voice carrying that strange excitement I'd heard on the phone, "I want you all to meet someone very special." He turned to look at the redhead with an expression I'd never seen him wear before, not even when he looked at me. It was pure adoration mixed with something that looked almost like worship. "This is Celeste Moreau." The name hit my ears like a foreign language. Celeste Moreau. It sounded expensive, sophisticated, like something out of a romance novel. I watched as she smiled demurely at the assembled family, her perfect white teeth catching the candlelight. "Celeste," David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "is the love of my life." The room erupted into a chaos of confused murmurs and sharp intakes of breath. I felt my knees buckle slightly, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself. Love of his life? What about me? What about our 15 years together? What about the vows we'd exchanged in this very house's garden? But before I could process the full impact of his words, Something even stranger happened. Celeste's gaze swept across the room, taking in the shocked faces of the Thornfield family, until her eyes landed on me. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute horror. The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint, and her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words barely audible across the room. It's you." She knew me. This woman who was supposedly the love of my husband's life knew me, and seeing me had clearly traumatized her. But I had never seen her before in my life. I was certain of it. A face like hers wasn't forgettable. "Celeste?" David turned to her, confusion clouding his features. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I have to go," she stammered, backing away from him and bumping into the china cabinet. Several delicate plates rattled ominously. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." "What are you talking about?" David reached for her, but she jerked away from his touch like he'd burned her. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice rising to near panic. "I'm so sorry. I never meant. I didn't know." And then she ran. She literally turned and fled through the dining room, past me in the doorway, through the entryway, and out the front door. We heard it slam behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. The dining room fell into stunned silence. 37 members of the Thornfield family sat or stood in complete bewilderment, looking between David and me like we were actors in a play whose script they couldn't follow. David stood at the head of the table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The confident man who'd just declared his love for another woman had been replaced by someone who looked lost and desperately confused. "David," Evelyn said carefully, her voice cutting through the silence, "what just happened?" I don't know." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling. "She said she had to meet my family. She insisted on coming tonight. And then she saw." His eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time I saw fear in them. Real, bone-deep fear. "She saw me," I finished quietly. The words hung in the air like an accusation. 'Cause that's what it was, wasn't it? An accusation. This woman, this stranger who was supposedly the love of my husband's life, had taken one look at me and fled in terror. People didn't react that way to strangers. They reacted that way to people they recognized, people they had reason to fear. "Natasha," David started, taking a step toward me, "I can explain." "Can you?" I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Because I'm having trouble understanding how your real love knows me when I've never seen her before in my life." The family was watching this exchange like a tennis match, heads turning between us with each volley. I could see questions forming on their faces, the same questions that were spinning through my mind like a hurricane. How long had this affair been going on? How many lies had David told? And most importantly, why did Celeste Moreau know me well enough to run screaming from the sight of me? "Maybe we should talk about this privately," David suggested, glancing meaningfully at his audience of relatives. "Oh no," I said, shaking my head slowly. "You made this public when you brought her here. You made this public when you introduced her as the love of your life in front of your entire family. We're way past private conversations now." Caroline stood up from her seat, her maternal instincts clearly kicking in despite the awkwardness of the situation. "Why don't I take the kids upstairs? They don't need to." "The kids stay," I said firmly. "They're old enough to understand that actions have consequences, that when you make choices you have to face them." I was thinking of David's 12-year-old nephew Timothy and his 10-year-old niece Sarah, but really I was thinking about David himself, how he'd apparently made the choice to betray our marriage, to humiliate me in front of his family, and now he was going to have to face the consequences. But even as I stood there, projecting a calm I didn't feel, my mind was racing backward through our recent history, looking for clues I'd missed, searching for signs of deception that I'd been too trusting, too comfortable in my marriage to notice. The late nights at the office that had become more frequent over the past year. The business trips that seemed to multiply. The way he'd started guarding his phone, taking it into the bathroom when he showered, sleeping with it face down on his nightstand. The expensive cologne I'd found in his car last month, a brand I'd never bought him. When I'd asked about it, he'd said a client had given it to him as a thank you gift. I'd believed him because I'd had no reason not to. The mysterious phone calls that always seemed to end abruptly when I walked into the room. Work stuff, he'd say with a dismissive wave. You'd be bored. God, I'd been so stupid. So trusting, so comfortable in my belief that our marriage was solid that I'd explained away every red flag, every inconsistency, every lie. But there was something else nagging at me, something beyond the obvious signs of infidelity. The way Celeste had looked at me wasn't just recognition, it was guilt. It was horror. It was the look of someone who'd been caught doing something unforgivable. What if this wasn't just about an affair? What if there was something deeper, something darker that I hadn't even begun to uncover? David, I said slowly, watching his face carefully, how long have you been seeing her? He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Natasha, please, can we just… How long? 2 years, he whispered. 2 years. 24 months of lies. 730 days of deception. While I'd been planning our future, saving for the house we wanted to buy, talking about maybe finally having children, he'd been building a whole separate life with someone else. But 2 years still didn't explain Celeste's reaction to seeing me. You don't run from someone just because you're sleeping with their husband. There had to be more. What else? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean? What else, David? What else aren't you telling me? Because that woman didn't run because she felt guilty about the affair. She ran because she recognized me, and she was terrified of what that meant. The fear in his eyes deepened, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was right. This was bigger than adultery. This was something that would make a woman bolt from a room like her life depended on it. And I was going to find out what it was. The drive home from Evelyn's house passed in a blur of streetlights and silent tears that I refused to let fall completely. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and every few blocks I had to remind myself to breathe. The familiar streets of Millbrook Heights looked different somehow, like I was seeing them through a stranger's eyes. David had tried to follow me out, calling my name as I walked to my car with as much dignity as I could muster. But I'd ignored him completely, started the engine, and driven away while he stood helplessly in his mother's driveway. Let him explain to his family why his wife had just left his birthday party after his mistress ran screaming into the night. By the time I pulled into our driveway on Elmwood Terrace, the house that had been our sanctuary for 8 years looked like a museum of lies. Every window glowing warmly in the darkness felt like a mockery. This was supposed to be our home, our safe space, the foundation we'd built our life on. Now it felt like a stage set for a play I'd never auditioned for. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the front door with its cheerful autumn wreath, the one I'd hung just last weekend, while humming contentedly and thinking about how lucky I was to have such a stable, loving marriage. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Finally, I forced myself to go inside. The house felt eerily quiet after the chaos of the family gathering, and every familiar object seemed to mock me with its normalcy. The throw pillows I'd arranged this morning, the coffee mug David had left in the sink, the grocery list on the refrigerator written in both our handwritings, evidence of a partnership that was apparently more one-sided than I'd ever realized. I walked through each room like I was seeing it for the first time, looking for clues I'd missed. In our bedroom, I stared at the king-sized bed we'd shared for 15 years, wondering how many nights he'd lain next to me thinking about her, how many mornings he'd kissed me goodbye before going to see his real love. The phrase echoed in my mind like a taunt. Real love. As if what we'd had wasn't real. As if 15 years of marriage, of building a life together, of supporting each other through deaths and job losses and dreams deferred, was somehow less authentic than whatever he'd found with Celeste Moreau. I opened his dresser drawers methodically, not sure what I was looking for, but driven by a compulsion to find something, anything, that would help me understand how completely I'd been living a lie. His clothes were folded neatly, just as they always were. His cologne bottles sat in their usual arrangement on the dresser top. Everything looked exactly as it should in the bedroom of a happily married man, except for the credit card statements I found tucked behind his sock drawer. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if it had been hastily hidden, and as I unfolded it, my hands began to shake. Restaurant charges at places we'd never been together. Hotel bookings in cities where he'd claimed to have business meetings but had never mentioned staying overnight. Jewelry purchases from Cartier, expensive pieces I'd certainly never received. But it was the recurring charge that made my blood run cold. Moreau Design Consultancy minus $5,000, appearing monthly for the past 18 months. He'd been paying her. Whatever their relationship was, money was changing hands in significant amounts. I sank onto the edge of our bed, the credit card statement trembling in my hands. This wasn't just an affair. This was something deeper, more calculated. You don't pay your mistress $5,000 a month unless there's something else going on, unless she has something you need, or something you're afraid of her revealing. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Please let me explain. It's not what you think. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. What I think is that you've been paying Celeste Moreau $5,000 a month for the past year and a half. So please, tell me what it really is. The typing indicator appeared and disappeared several times before his response came. How did you find that? Not a denial, not an explanation, just a question about how I'd discovered his secret. That told me everything I needed to know about where his priorities lay. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and did what I should have done the moment I heard her name. I Googled Celeste Moreau. The results were immediate and extensive. Celeste Moreau wasn't just some random woman David had fallen for. She was a high-end interior designer with a client list that read like a who's who of Millbrook Heights' wealthiest residents. Her website showcased stunning homes, each one worth millions, and her bio described her as transforming spaces for the city's most discerning clientele. But as I scrolled through image after image of her work, something began to feel familiar. The color schemes, the furniture arrangements, the architectural details. They reminded me of something, but I couldn't place what. Then I found it. Buried on the third page of search results was a local newspaper article from 3 years ago. Rising designer wins prestigious renovation contract. The accompanying photo showed Celeste standing in front of a partially renovated Victorian home, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she smiled confidently at the camera. I recognized that house. I'd driven past it countless times on my way to work. It was the old Pemberton mansion on Heritage Hill, a historic property that had been abandoned for years before someone had bought it and restored it to its former glory. I remembered admiring the renovation work, thinking whoever had designed it had exquisite taste. But why did that matter? Why did seeing that photo make my skin crawl with recognition? I clicked on the article, reading every word carefully. The renovation had been commissioned by, quote, a private investor who wishes to remain anonymous. And the project had taken nearly 2 years to complete. The house had been transformed from a crumbling relic into one of the most beautiful properties in the city. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as a terrible thought began to form. David was in real estate development. He specialized in historic renovations. And 3 years ago, right around the time he'd apparently met Celeste, he'd been working on several major projects in the Heritage Hill area. I opened a new browser window and searched for property records, my heart pounding as I navigated through the county assessor's website. It took me nearly an hour to find what I was looking for, but when I did, the room seemed to tilt around me. The Pemberton mansion had been purchased 3 years ago by Thornfield Development LLC, David's company. The same company that employed me as their bookkeeper, though I'd never seen this particular property in any of the files David had given me to manage. He'd bought a $1 million historic mansion, hired Celeste to renovate it, and somehow kept the entire transaction hidden from his wife, who literally managed his business finances. The monthly payments to Moreau Design Consultancy weren't just for her design services. They were ongoing payments for something else entirely. But what? And why had she looked at me like she'd seen a ghost? I thought about David's reaction when she'd run from the room. He'd seemed genuinely surprised by her terror, which meant he didn't know why seeing me had affected her so dramatically. Whatever secret Celeste was keeping, she was keeping it from both of us. My phone rang, David's name flashing on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. "Nat, please. I know how this looks, but there are things you don't understand. Things I couldn't tell you because I was trying to protect you. Celeste isn't. She's not what you think she is, and what we have isn't what you think it is either. Please, just let me come home so I can explain everything." Protect me from what? And if Celeste wasn't his mistress, then what was she? Why was he paying her $5,000 a month? Why did she know me well enough to run in terror at the sight of me? I saved the voicemail and opened a new document on my laptop, beginning to type everything I'd discovered so far: the timeline, the payments, the hidden property purchase. If David thought he could waltz back into our house and explain away 2 years of lies with some story about protection, he was mistaken. I was done being the naive wife who trusted blindly and asked no questions. I was done being kept in the dark about my own life, my own marriage, my own husband's business dealings. Whatever game David and Celeste had been playing, whatever secret they'd been keeping, I was going to uncover every last detail. Because I had a feeling that the woman who'd run from that dining room hadn't just recognized me, she'd been afraid of me, and I intended to find out why. The old Natasha, the one who'd walked into that birthday party just hours ago, would have waited for David to come home and trusted his explanation. She would have believed his promises and accepted his version of events because she'd been conditioned to smooth over problems, to keep the peace, to be the understanding wife. But that woman was gone. In her place sat someone harder, sharper, determined to find the truth no matter how ugly it might be. And as I sat in our bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a marriage I was beginning to realize I'd never truly understood, I made myself a promise. I would not be anyone's victim. Not David's, not Celeste's, not even my own naive trusts. The real Natasha was about to emerge, and she was going to get answers. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent the hours between midnight and dawn, systematically dismantling the life I thought I knew, piece by careful piece. Armed with coffee that had gone cold hours ago and a determination that felt like steel in my veins, I turned our home office upside down, looking for every scrap of evidence that could explain the web of lies David had been weaving. The filing cabinet he'd always told me was just old tax stuff, nothing important, yielded a treasure trove of documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements for accounts I didn't know existed. Insurance policies on properties that weren't listed in our joint assets. And, most disturbing of all, a series of contracts with something called Heritage Hill Preservation Society, an organization I'd never heard of despite supposedly managing all of David's business paperwork. By 3 a.m. I had spread everything across the dining room table like a detective working a case, which I suppose I was. The pattern that emerged was breathtaking in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. David hadn't just bought the Pemberton mansion. Over the past 3 years, he'd quietly acquired 7 historic properties throughout Millbrook Heights, all through shell companies and hidden transactions. Each property had been renovated by Celeste Moreau, and each renovation had been completed just before the property was sold at a massive profit to buyers whose names I couldn't trace through public records. But here's what made my blood run cold. Every single one of these properties had been purchased using fraudulent loan applications. Applications that bore my forged signature as a co-borrower, listing me as a partner in Thornfield Development LLC with an inflated income that supposedly justified the massive mortgages. My hands shook as I studied signature after signature that looked like mine but weren't quite right. Someone had practiced my handwriting extensively, but they hadn't perfected the small, unconscious flourish I added to the N in Natasha, or the way I always dotted my I's slightly to the left. These signatures were good, professional quality forgeries, but they weren't mine. 7 properties, 7 fraudulent loans. Collectively, I was apparently on the hook for over $4 million in debt I'd never agreed to take on. But the most damning evidence wasn't the forged signatures or the hidden bank accounts. It was a series of emails I found in a folder buried deep in David's computer files, messages between him and someone identified only as HPS coordinator. The emails read like reports from a military operation. Property acquired, designer in place, timeline proceeding as planned. Buyer identified. Background clean. Transaction will complete by month end. Next target identified, 847 Rosewood Avenue. Same parameters as previous acquisitions. 847 Rosewood Avenue. I knew that address. It was Mrs. Chen's house, the elderly widow who lived 3 blocks over, whose Victorian cottage was one of the most charming properties in the neighborhood. The woman who'd been struggling to afford basic maintenance since her husband died. The one who'd mentioned to me just last month that she was worried about having to sell because she couldn't keep up with repairs. The last email in the chain was dated just 2 weeks ago. Chen property vulnerable, financial pressure increasing, expect acquisition opportunity within 60 days. They were targeting vulnerable elderly homeowners, forcing them into financial distress, then swooping in to buy their properties at below-market prices before flipping them for massive profits. And they were using my identity to secure the financing for their scheme. But who was HPS coordinator? And how did Celeste fit into all of this beyond just being the designer? I opened a new browser window and searched for Heritage Hill Preservation Society. The results were surprisingly sparse for what appeared to be a legitimate organization. Their website was professionally designed but vague, full of generic language about preserving architectural heritage and sustainable community development. No staff listings, no board members, no specific projects mentioned. The contact information led to a P.O. box and a phone number with a generic voicemail message. But buried in the site's footer was a small line of text that made my heart skip. Consulting services provided by Moreau Design Consultancy. Celeste wasn't just renovating the properties. She was running the entire operation. I leaned back in my desk chair, the scope of the conspiracy finally becoming clear. Celeste had created a fake preservation society as a front for a real estate fraud scheme. She'd seduced David into being her inside man in the local development community, used his business as a vehicle for the fraudulent loans, and forged my signature to legitimize transactions worth millions of dollars. But why had she run when she saw me? If I was just an unknowing victim whose identity she'd stolen, seeing me shouldn't have caused that level of panic. I pulled up the property records again, this time focusing on the dates. The first fraudulent loan had been taken out 3 years and 2 months ago. That was significant. It was just 2 weeks before David and I had attended a charity gala for the Millbrook Heights Historical Society. I found the photos from that event on my phone, scrolling through images of David and me posing with other attendees, smiling and champagne glasses in hand. And there, in the background of one photo, was a woman with auburn hair in an elegant black dress, deep in conversation with the society's president. Celeste Moreau had been at that gala. She'd been in the same room as David and me 3 years ago, right before their relationship had supposedly begun. But as I zoomed in on the photo, studying her face, a memory began to surface. Something about the way she held her head, the shape of her profile, the gesture of her hand as she spoke. I'd seen her before, not at the gala, somewhere else, somewhere that mattered. I opened my laptop's photo library and began searching through years of images, looking for something I couldn't quite name but knew I'd recognize when I found it. Family gatherings, vacations, work events, random snapshots from around town. And then I found it. The photo was from 4 years ago, taken at the grand opening of the new wing at Millbrook General Hospital. David and I had attended because his company had donated materials for the construction. In the crowd of dignitaries and community leaders, barely visible in the background, was a woman with dark hair and glasses, wearing a hospital volunteer badge. I zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. Different hair color, different styling, but the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Celeste. 4 years ago, she'd been working at the hospital, where I received all my medical care, where I'd had my annual physicals, my mammograms, my blood work, where all my personal information, including my social security number and signature samples, would have been on file. She hadn't seduced David and then stolen my identity to facilitate their romance. She'd stolen my identity first, then targeted David as a useful partner for her fraud scheme. Their relationship wasn't a love affair that had gone too far. It was a criminal conspiracy from the very beginning. And she'd run from that dining room because she'd never expected to come face to face with the woman whose identity she'd been using for years. Seeing me there, in person, had shattered the illusion of safety she'd built around her crimes. But there was still one piece missing. David's voicemail had said he was trying to protect me. If he was a willing participant in Celeste's scheme, what did he think he was protecting me from? I scrolled through more of the emails, looking for clues, until I found a message thread that made everything click into place. Target becoming suspicious about business finances. Recommend accelerated timeline. Agreed. How do we handle the liability issue? Same as always. She'll take the fall when this unravels. All evidence points to her as primary conspirator. They weren't just using my identity to commit fraud. They were setting me up to take the blame when their scheme inevitably collapsed. Every forged signature, every fraudulent loan application, every illegal transaction was designed to make it look like I was the mastermind behind the entire operation. When the authorities finally caught up with them, they would find a paper trail that led directly to me, a woman with access to her husband's business, with the knowledge and opportunity to forge documents, with apparent motives for financial gain. David and Celeste would disappear with their profits, leaving me to face federal fraud charges that could put me in prison for decades. The protection David had mentioned wasn't about keeping me safe from harm. It was about keeping me ignorant of the trap they'd built around me until it was too late to escape. I sat in the pre-dawn darkness of our home office, surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so complete it took my breath away. My husband hadn't just been cheating on me. He'd been systematically destroying my life, setting me up as the fall guy for crimes I'd never even known were being committed. But they'd made one crucial mistake. Celeste's panic at seeing me had exposed their operation before they were ready to spring their trap. Instead of discovering their scheme when the FBI knocked on my door with an arrest warrant, I'd found out while there was still time to fight back. I opened a new document and began typing, carefully recording every piece of evidence I'd uncovered. The forged signatures, the hidden properties, the fraudulent loans, the connection to the hospital where my personal information had been compromised. I photographed every document, saved every email, documented every transaction. By the time the sun rose over Millbrook Heights, I had built a case that would expose the truth about David and Celeste's conspiracy. But more than that, I had proof of my own innocence, evidence that I'd been the victim, not the perpetrator, of their elaborate fraud. David's key turned in the front door, just as I was closing the last file. I heard his footsteps in the hallway, slow and hesitant, like he was afraid of what he might find. "Natasha," he called out softly. "Are you awake? We need to talk." I smiled grimly, my hand resting on the stack of evidence I'd compiled. "Yes," I called back, my voice steady and calm. "We definitely need to talk." He had no idea that the conversation he was about to have would be nothing like the one he'd planned. The naive wife he'd been counting on to remain ignorant was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who knew exactly who she was dealing with and exactly what she was going to do about it. David appeared in the doorway of our home office looking like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. His usually immaculate hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night spent probably rehearsing whatever lies he planned to tell me. What he didn't expect was to find me sitting calmly at our dining room table, surrounded by neat stacks of documents, my laptop open, and a small digital recorder placed prominently in the center of the table. I'd spent the last hour of dawn organizing everything I'd discovered into a presentation that would have made any prosecutor proud. "Natasha," he began, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, "I know you're angry, but please let me explain." "Sit down, David," I said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from me. My voice was steady, almost conversational, which seemed to unnerve him more than if I'd been screaming. "We have a lot to discuss." He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes taking in the documents spread across our dining room table. I watched as recognition dawned on his face. These weren't just random papers. These were his secrets, laid bare in the morning light. "Where did you find all this?" he asked, sinking into the chair like a man accepting his execution. "In our house, David. In the filing cabinet you told me contained boring tax stuff. In your computer, which apparently I never should have had access to since I'm only the bookkeeper for your legitimate business." I picked up the Heritage Hill Preservation Society contract and placed it in front of him. "Tell me about this organization that doesn't seem to exist anywhere except on paper." He stared at the document, his jaw working silently. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, trying to calculate how much I knew and how much he could still hide. "It's complicated," he finally said. "Uncomplicated." I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed. "You have exactly one chance to tell me the truth, David, complete truth. Because I spent all night connecting dots, and I already know far more than you think I do." He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the moment he realized that the woman sitting across from him wasn't the same person who'd left his mother's party in shock and tears. This was someone harder, someone who'd spent the dark hours before dawn transforming pain into purpose. "Celeste approached me 3 years ago," he began slowly. "She said she had a business proposition. Historic renovations are profitable, but the startup costs are enormous. She had access to funding sources that could make us both rich." "Funding sources?" I tapped the stack of loan applications with my finger. "You mean my forged signature on fraudulent mortgage applications?" His face went white. "You weren't supposed to ever see those. The plan was to frame me when your little scheme collapsed," I finished. "I found the emails, David. All of them. Including the ones where you and your HPS coordinator discussed how I would take the fall when the authorities caught up with you." The silence that followed was deafening. David opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. He looked like a fish drowning in air, gasping for explanations that didn't exist. "How long have you known Celeste was using my medical records to steal my identity?" I continued, pulling out the hospital photo I'd discovered. "Because this picture shows her working at Millbrook General 4 years ago, which means she was planning this long before she supposedly seduced you with her business proposition." David's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I didn't know about the medical records until 6 months ago. I swear, Natasha. When she first approached me, I thought she was just a designer with investors. By the time I realized how deep this went, I was already in too deep to get out." "Too deep?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "David, you forged my signature on documents worth $4 million. You used our marriage, our shared assets, our joint credit history to legitimize federal crimes. How exactly did you think this was going to end?" She said she had everything under control, that the buyers were legitimate, that the properties would be sold quickly, and that all the loans would be paid off before anyone noticed the irregularities in the paperwork. He ran his hands through his hair. She said you would never have to know, that you'd be protected from any consequences. Protected. I picked up another document, the email chain discussing Mrs. Chen's vulnerable property. Is this how you protect people, David? By targeting elderly widows and forcing them out of their homes? He flinched as if I'd slapped him. That wasn't my idea. Celeste handles the acquisition side. I just provide the development expertise and the business credentials. Just provide the development expertise, I repeated slowly, and your wife's stolen identity, and your family's reputation, and your business license that legitimizes the entire operation. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. Tell me, David, what exactly did you think you were getting out of this arrangement? Money, he said quietly. More money than we could ever make legitimately. Enough to pay off our mortgage, buy the house we always talked about, maybe finally have children without worrying about college funds or retirement savings. We? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. There is no we in this, David. You made these decisions unilaterally. You forged my signature, stole my identity, and planned to sacrifice my freedom for your greed. And you did it all while lying to my face every single day for 3 years. I walked to the window, looking out at our neighborhood where Mrs. Chen was probably having her morning coffee, completely unaware that she was being targeted by a criminal conspiracy that included her neighbor's husband. Do you love her? I asked, not turning around. Who? Celeste, your real love, as you called her in front of your entire family. The pause was long enough to be an answer in itself. It's complicated. I turned to face him, and he must have seen something in my expression that made him shrink back in his chair. No, David, loving someone is complicated. What you have with Celeste is a criminal partnership with benefits. There's a difference. Natasha, please. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but we can fix this. We can make this right. We? I sat back down and picked up my phone. There is no we anymore, David. You chose Celeste and her money over me and our marriage. You chose crime over honesty. You chose to make me a victim and a scapegoat rather than your partner. What are you doing? He asked, watching me scroll through my contacts. I'm calling my lawyer, I said calmly. Then I'm calling the FBI. Then I'm calling Mrs. Chen to warn her that someone is trying to steal her house. You can't. David lunged forward, reaching for my phone, but I pulled it back out of his reach. I can, and I will. I stood up, putting the dining room table between us. Did you really think I would just roll over and let you destroy my life? Did you honestly believe I would quietly go to prison so you and your criminal girlfriend could disappear with your stolen millions? If you turn us in, you'll be implicated too. Your signature is on those documents. Your name is on those accounts. How will you prove you didn't know? I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd felt since walking into his mother's birthday party. Because, David, I spent all night building a case that proves exactly that. Every forged signature analyzed and documented. Every fraudulent transaction traced back to its source. Every piece of evidence that shows I was the victim, not the perpetrator. I gestured to the organized stacks of papers on the table. Did you know that Celeste made a mistake when she forged my signature on the Pemberton Mansion loan? She dotted the I in my middle name wrong. It's a small detail, but it's documented in every piece of handwriting analysis I had done 3 years ago when I updated our will. David's face went from white to gray. You had handwriting analysis done? For insurance purposes, to prevent exactly this kind of fraud. I picked up a folder from the table. I also have copies of every legitimate document I've ever signed, including the ones from our mortgage applications and business partnerships. The differences are subtle, but they're consistent. A forensic handwriting expert will have no trouble distinguishing my real signature from Celeste's forgeries. You're really going to destroy everything we've built together, he said quietly. No, David, you already did that. I walked to the front door and opened it. What I'm going to do is save myself from the wreckage you created and make sure that you and Celeste face the consequences of your choices. Where am I supposed to go? I don't care. Call Celeste. I'm sure she has a plan for situations like this. Criminals usually do. He stood slowly, like an old man, and walked toward the door. When he reached the threshold, he turned back one last time. I never meant for it to go this far, he said. Yes, you did, I replied. Every signature you forged, every lie you told, every night you came home to me after spending the day planning my destruction. You meant all of it. You just never meant to get caught. I closed the door behind him and turned the deadbolt, a sound that felt like the final punctuation mark on 15 years of marriage. Then I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Margaret Sinclair, the best criminal defense attorney in Millbrook Heights. Margaret? It's Natasha Thornfield. I need your help, and I need it today. I've discovered that I'm the victim of a massive fraud scheme, and I need to turn myself in before someone else does it for me. As I spoke, I looked out the window at David's car pulling out of our driveway for what I knew would be the last time. He'd made his choice when he'd chosen crime over our marriage. Now it was my turn to choose. And I was choosing to fight. Margaret Sinclair's law office on Courthouse Square was exactly what I'd expected. Polished mahogany, leather-bound books, and an atmosphere that radiated competence and discretion. What I hadn't expected was how quickly she'd agreed to see me on a Sunday morning, or how seriously she'd taken my situation once I'd explained the basics over the phone. Mrs. Thornfield, she said, rising from behind her desk as her assistant showed me in, I've been practicing criminal defense for 23 years, and I can count on one hand the number of clients who've walked into my office with this level of documentation before charges were even filed. I set my carefully organized evidence on her conference table, 3 bankers' boxes of documents, photographs, printed emails, and my detailed timeline of discoveries. I need to know where I stand legally, and I need to know how to protect myself from what's coming. Margaret spent the next 2 hours methodically reviewing everything I'd brought. She made notes, asked pointed questions, and occasionally looked up at me with expressions that ranged from impressed to concerned to downright angry on my behalf. This is sophisticated, she finally said, closing the last folder. Your husband and his partner have been operating a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme with remarkable attention to detail. The forged signatures alone represent dozens of felony counts. But where does that leave me? Honestly, in a better position than most fraud victims I've seen. She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what looked like a timeline. The key is that you discovered this before they implemented their exit strategy. They haven't disappeared with the money yet, which means there's still time to prove your innocence proactively rather than reactively. What do you mean by exit strategy? Margaret pointed to one of the email printouts. According to this correspondence, they were planning to complete their final property sale within the next month, then liquidate all assets and disappear. At that point, when the loans started defaulting and the banks began investigating, all evidence would point to you as the mastermind who vanished with the money. The room felt cold despite the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. How close did they come to succeeding? Very close. If you hadn't attended that family gathering last night, if Celeste hadn't panicked and blown their cover, you probably would have been arrested within 60 days on federal fraud charges carrying a potential sentence of 20 to 30 years. I sat back in the leather chair, the magnitude of what I'd narrowly escaped hitting me like a physical blow. 3 more weeks of blissful ignorance, and my life would have been over. So what do we do now? We go on the offensive, Margaret said firmly. We contact the FBI immediately, voluntarily surrender all evidence, and present you as a cooperating victim rather than a target. The sooner we get ahead of this, the better your position will be when arrests start happening. Arrests? Oh yes. This is going to result in multiple federal arrests. Wire fraud, mortgage fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering. Your husband and Celeste are looking at serious prison time. She paused, studying my face. How do you feel about that? The question surprised me. How did I feel about David going to prison? 12 hours ago, I'd been married to him. This morning, I'd discovered he'd spent 3 years systematically planning my destruction. I feel like justice, I said quietly. Margaret smiled grimly. Good. Because what happens next is going to require you to be absolutely ruthless in protecting yourself. No misguided loyalty, no second-guessing, no mercy for people who showed you none. She picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. Agent Rebecca Torres? It's Margaret Sinclair. I have a client who needs to speak with you about a major fraud case. Today, if possible. By 2 p.m., I was sitting in a sterile FBI conference room, facing Agent Torres and her partner, Agent Chen. The federal building was intimidating in a way that Margaret's office hadn't been, all concrete and fluorescent lights and the weight of government authority. Mrs. Thornfield, Agent Torres began, before we start, I want you to understand that anything you tell us can and will be used in any future prosecutions. Your attorney has advised you of your rights? She has. I placed my hands flat on the table, surprised by how steady they were. I want to report that I've been the victim of identity theft and fraud, and I want to cooperate fully with any investigation. For the next 3 hours, I walked them through everything. The discovery at the family gathering, the all-night investigation, the evidence I'd compiled. I handed over copies of every document, every email, every piece of proof I'd gathered. Agent Chen seemed particularly interested in the Heritage Hill Preservation Society connection. We've been tracking unusual activity in the historic district for the past year, he said. Several elderly homeowners have reported being contacted by people claiming to represent preservation societies, offering to help them maintain their properties in exchange for various agreements. They're targeting vulnerable seniors, I said. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor, is next on their list according to the emails. Not anymore, Agent Torres said grimly. We'll be posting surveillance on her property starting tonight. They asked about David's whereabouts, about Celeste's habits, about the timeline of the scheme. I answered every question honestly, even when those answers painted me as naive or willfully blind to warning signs I should have noticed. What will happen now? I asked as the interview was wrapping up. We'll begin immediate surveillance of both suspects, Agent Torres explained. Based on your evidence, we have probable cause for search warrants on the properties, the bank accounts, and their personal residences. We'll move fast. Fraud suspects tend to run when they realize they're exposed. How fast? Within 48 hours, we'll have them in custody. As Margaret and I left the federal building, the late afternoon sun felt different somehow, cleaner. I'd spent 15 years living a lie without knowing it, but now, for the first time in my adult life, I was living in complete truth. What happens to me while all this is playing out? I asked as we reached our cars. You go home. You live your life. You don't contact David or Celeste under any circumstances. Let the FBI handle all communication. And you prepare yourself for the fact that this is going to be a very public scandal once arrests are made. I thought about that as I drove home through Millbrook Heights. The neighborhood looked the same as it had yesterday morning, but everything had changed. By tomorrow, everyone would know that David Thornfield had been arrested for fraud, that his wife had been the one to turn him in. That 15 years of marriage had ended with FBI handcuffs. The house on Elmwood Terrace felt different too. Bigger somehow, like it had been holding its breath for years and could finally exhale. I walked through each room, seeing it as my space for the first time rather than our space. In the bedroom, I gathered David's remaining clothes and personal items, boxing them efficiently and without sentiment. Whatever man I'd loved had disappeared long before last night, replaced by a criminal who'd been willing to sacrifice my freedom for his greed. My phone rang as I was taping up the last box. Unknown number. Natasha? Celeste's voice was shaky, desperate. We need to talk. I almost hung up, but something in her tone made me hesitate. We have nothing to discuss. Please. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. There are people involved in this who won't hesitate to hurt you if you interfere with their business. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to protect you. David doesn't know everything about who's really behind this operation. If you go to the police, you'll be putting yourself in real danger. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. What are you talking about? Meet me tonight, Riverside Park by the old gazebo, 9 p.m. Come alone, and I'll tell you everything. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. Was this a trap? A desperate attempt to manipulate me into silence? Or was there really something bigger and more dangerous than I'd realized? I called Margaret immediately. Absolutely not, she said before I'd even finished explaining. You do not meet with suspects in an active federal investigation. You do not go anywhere alone. You call Agent Torres right now and report this contact. But as I hung up with Margaret and dialed Agent Torres's number, I couldn't shake the feeling that Celeste's fear had been genuine. That there was still something I didn't know, something that could change everything. The question was I brave enough to find out what it was? Or smart enough to let the FBI handle it while I stayed safely out of the way? As I waited for Agent Torres to answer her phone, I realized that the scared, naive woman who'd walked into that birthday party was truly gone forever. In her place was someone who'd learned to trust her instincts, to fight for herself, and to make hard choices. Whatever came next, I'd face it with my eyes wide open. Agent Torres answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with the efficiency of someone who never truly went off duty. Mrs. Thornfield, what's happened? Celeste Moreau just called me, I said, pacing around my living room. She wants to meet tonight at Riverside Park. She said there are people involved who will hurt me if I interfere with their business. The silence on the other end was brief but loaded. What exactly did she say? I repeated the conversation word for word, including Celeste's claim that David didn't know everything about who was really behind the operation. When I finished, Agent Torres was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Agent Torres? I'm here. Mrs. Thornfield. Under no circumstances should you meet with Ms. Moreau tonight. We've been monitoring phone traffic since our meeting this afternoon, and this call confirms what we suspected. You're dealing with something much larger than a two-person fraud scheme. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I can't discuss details of an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you that Heritage Hill Preservation Society has connections to financial crimes in 3 other states. What your husband stumbled into, or was recruited for, appears to be part of a sophisticated interstate fraud ring. I sank into my armchair, the implications washing over me like ice water. David said Celeste approached him with the business proposition. What if she was just following orders? That's exactly what we think happened. Small-time operators like your husband are perfect recruits. They have legitimate businesses, local connections, and enough financial desperation to be tempted by easy money. They're also perfect fall guys when operations need to be shut down quickly. And the wives? The wives are collateral damage. Your identity theft wasn't random, Mrs. Thornfield. You were specifically chosen because your husband's business needed legitimacy, and married couples filing joint financial documents raise fewer red flags than single applicants for large commercial loans. I thought about that hospital volunteer badge in the photo, about how Celeste had positioned herself to access my medical records years before approaching David. How many other wives are out there with forged signatures on loans they don't know about? We're investigating that now. Your case is the first time we've had someone come forward proactively with this level of documentation. Usually we only discover these schemes after they've collapsed and the primary suspects have disappeared. What happens to Celeste's meeting request? We'll be there instead. If she's genuine about wanting to cooperate, she can do it through proper channels with federal agents present. If she's planning something else, Agent Torres paused. Let's just say we'll be prepared for multiple contingencies. After ending the call, I tried to focus on practical matters. Changing the locks, forwarding David's mail to a P.O. box, canceling joint credit cards. But my mind kept circling back to Celeste's phone call. The fear in her voice had sounded real, not calculated. What if she genuinely was trying to warn me about something the FBI didn't know yet? By 8 p.m., I was stationed at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching for any unusual activity in the neighborhood. Agent Torres had assured me that surveillance was in place, but I couldn't see any evidence of federal agents. That was probably the point. At 8:47 p.m., my doorbell rang. I approached the front door cautiously, peering through the peephole to see Evelyn Thornfield standing on my front porch. David's mother looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, and she was clutching her purse like a lifeline. "Evelyn?" I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "What are you doing here?" "Natasha, dear, I need to talk to you. About last night, about David, about everything." Her voice was strained, like she'd been crying. "May I come in?" I hesitated. According to Agent Torres, I shouldn't be talking to anyone connected to the case without federal supervision. But this was Evelyn, the woman who'd treated me like a daughter for 15 years, who'd taught me her pot roast recipe, who'd held my hand through 2 miscarriages when David was too emotionally frozen to offer comfort. "Just for a few minutes," I said, releasing the chain. Evelyn stepped inside and immediately began pacing my entryway like a caged animal. "David came to see me this afternoon. He told me everything, Natasha. About the loans, about the forged signatures, about what they've been doing to you." "What did he tell you exactly?" "That he's been involved in some kind of business scheme with that woman and that you found out about it last night. He said you're threatening to go to the police and that you could destroy our entire family." I led her to the living room, noting how she kept glancing toward the windows as if she expected someone to be watching. "Evelyn, David has been committing federal crimes. He forged my signature on documents worth millions of dollars. I've already been to the FBI." Her face went white. "The FBI? Oh, Natasha, what have you done?" "I've protected myself from going to prison for crimes I didn't commit." I sat across from her, studying her reaction carefully. David and Celeste were planning to frame me as the mastermind behind their fraud scheme. Did he mention that part? That's impossible. David would never what, lie to you? Steal? Forge his wife's signature? Because he's done all of those things, Evelyn, for 3 years. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting in her lap. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. "There's something I need to tell you. Something David doesn't know." My pulse quickened. "What?" 6 months ago, I was contacted by someone claiming to represent a company that helps families with financial difficulties. They said they'd heard through community connections that David's business was struggling, and they wanted to offer assistance. "What kind of assistance?" "They offered to buy out some of David's existing contracts at above-market rates, giving him immediate cash flow to expand his operations. In exchange, I would need to provide character references and some basic family financial information." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of financial information?" "Bank statements, tax returns, information about family assets." Evelyn's voice dropped to a whisper. "I gave them everything, Natasha. I thought I was helping David save his business." "Who contacted you? Do you remember the name?" "Heritage Hill Preservation Society." The representative said they specialized in supporting local businesses involved in historic renovation projects. The room seemed to tilt around me. They hadn't just recruited David, they'd recruited his mother as an unwitting accomplice, using her maternal instincts to gather intelligence about our family's financial situation. "Evelyn, did you give them information about me specifically?" "They asked about David's household finances, his wife's employment, any joint assets that might affect his business operations." She looked up at me with growing horror. "Did I help them hurt you?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your mother-in-law's visit is very touching, but she won't be able to protect you from what's coming. Last chance to meet tonight. Riverside Park. Come alone or face the consequences. I showed the message to Evelyn, watching her face drain of color as she read it. They're watching us, she whispered. We need to call the FBI immediately. I reached for my phone, but Evelyn grabbed my wrist. Natasha, wait, there's something else. Her grip was surprisingly strong. The people who contacted me, they knew things about our family that they shouldn't have known. Personal things. Private things that only someone very close to us would know. What kind of things? They knew about David's gambling problem from college. They knew about the miscarriages you suffered. They knew that Thomas had been arrested for DUI 5 years ago, something we kept completely private. Evelyn's eyes were wide with fear. They've been watching our family for years, gathering information, waiting for the right opportunity. My phone rang. Agent Torres. Mrs. Thornfield? We have a problem. We've lost surveillance contact with Ms. Moreau, and there's been unusual activity around your neighborhood in the past hour. I need you to lock your doors and stay inside until we can get additional units to your location. Agent Torres, my mother-in-law's here, and she has information about Heritage Hill Preservation Society that you need to hear. Put me on speaker. For the next 10 minutes, Evelyn repeated everything she'd told me while Agent Torres asked rapid-fire questions about dates, names, and specific details about the financial information she'd provided. Mrs. Thornfield Sr., Agent Torres said when Evelyn finished, you've been cooperating with a criminal organization for 6 months. The information you provided was used to target your daughter-in-law for identity theft and frame her for federal crimes. Evelyn began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. I was trying to help my son. I thought I was saving his business. You were manipulated by professionals, Agent Torres said, her voice softening slightly. This organization specializes in exploiting family relationships to gather intelligence and recruit operatives. A car door slammed outside, and we both looked toward the front window. Through the sheer curtains, I could see a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there earlier. Agent Torres, there's a vehicle outside that I don't recognize. We see it. Mrs. Thornfield, I need you and your mother-in-law to go to the most interior room of your house and stay there until we give you the all-clear. Do not answer the door for anyone who doesn't identify themselves as federal law enforcement. As Evelyn and I huddled in my bedroom closet, I realized that what had started as a personal betrayal had evolved into something far more dangerous. We weren't just dealing with a cheating husband and his criminal girlfriend. We were dealing with an organization sophisticated enough to monitor families for years, patient enough to build complex schemes over time, and ruthless enough to eliminate threats when their operations were exposed. The woman who'd walked into that birthday party yesterday had been worried about her marriage. The woman crouched in a closet tonight was worried about staying alive long enough to see justice done. Outside, I could hear the sound of multiple vehicles arriving, car doors slamming and voices shouting commands. The FBI had arrived in force, and whatever confrontation was about to happen would determine whether I'd live to see my 39th birthday. Evelyn reached over and squeezed my hand in the darkness. I'm so sorry, dear, for everything. I know, I whispered back, but we're going to survive this. Both of us. I just hoped I was right. The sounds outside intensified. Car doors slamming, radios crackling, and the distinct cadence of law enforcement personnel coordinating a tactical response. Evelyn and I sat in the darkness of my bedroom closet, her breathing shallow and rapid beside me as we waited for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then my phone rang. David's number. Don't answer it, Evelyn whispered, but I was already swiping to accept the call. Natasha, thank God. David's voice was strained, panicked. Listen to me very carefully. You're in serious danger. These people aren't just criminals. They're dangerous. You need to get out of your house right now. Where are you, David? I'm with Celeste. We're at a safe location, but they know we've been compromised. They're cleaning house, which means anyone who can identify them is a liability. His voice cracked. That includes you, me, Celeste, and anyone else who's seen their operation. Through my bedroom window, I could see flashlight beams moving through my backyard. Whether they belonged to FBI agents or the people David was warning me about, I couldn't tell. David, the FBI is here. Agent Torres told me to stay inside until… The FBI doesn't understand what they're dealing with, he interrupted. These people have law enforcement contacts. They'll know exactly how to avoid federal surveillance, and they won't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to save your life. The desperation in his voice was palpable. Natasha, I know I've destroyed everything between us. I know you'll never forgive me. But please, for once in your life, don't be stubborn. Get out of that house and meet us at the old Miller warehouse on Industrial Boulevard. We can protect you until this is over. I looked at Evelyn, who was shaking her head frantically. Even in the dim closet light, I could see the terror in her eyes. David, I'm not going anywhere with you and Celeste. You've lied to me for 3 years. Why would I trust you now? Because despite everything I've done, I still love you. And because the alternative is that you end up dead in your own home while the FBI stands around wondering what went wrong. The line went dead. Immediately, my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Torres. Suspects contained, 2 individuals in custody, remain in secure location until all clear. But before I could feel relief, another text arrived from an unknown number. Your husband is lying. We have David and Celeste. Come to Riverside Park alone in 30 minutes or they die. No police, we're watching. Evelyn read the message over my shoulder and grabbed my arm. Don't even think about it. It's obviously a trap. But what if they really do have David and Celeste? What if the people Agent Torres arrested weren't the right ones? Then the FBI will handle it. Natasha, you're not responsible for saving David from the consequences of his own choices. She was right, but the texts had planted seeds of doubt. What if the federal agents outside were walking into an ambush? What if this criminal organization was sophisticated enough to have anticipated FBI involvement? My landline rang, the old-fashioned bell cutting through the tension like a blade. I'd forgotten I even still had a landline. It was something David had insisted on keeping for emergencies. Mrs. Thornfield? An unfamiliar voice, professional but urgent. This is Agent Martinez with the FBI. I'm calling on a secure line because we believe your cell phone may be compromised. Are you in Mrs. Thornfield's senior safe? Yes, we're in my bedroom closet as instructed. Good. I need you to stay exactly where you are. We've encountered some complications with the operation tonight, and we're working to resolve them. Under no circumstances should you leave your current location or respond to any text messages you may receive. Agent Martinez, I just got texts saying you have suspects in custody, but also messages claiming that David and Celeste are being held hostage, which is true. There was a pause that lasted too long. Ma'am, I can't discuss operational details, but I need you to understand that this organization uses psychological manipulation as a primary tactic. They want you confused and scared because confused people make poor decisions. So David and Celeste aren't being held hostage? I cannot confirm or deny the status of any individuals at this time. What I can tell you is that your safety depends on you staying exactly where you are until we give you the all clear. After he hung up, I stared at my phone feeling more confused than ever. 3 different people claiming to represent 3 different factions, each insisting they were trying to protect me, each demanding I follow their specific instructions. Evelyn seemed to read my thoughts. When everyone claims to be helping you, nobody is helping you. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. The agents outside your house are not FBI. Real federal agents don't conduct operations without proper identification and warrants. Look out your window. Do you see any marked vehicles? Any official badges or uniforms? Your life depends on recognizing the truth. I crawled to my bedroom window and carefully lifted one corner of the curtain. In the street below, I could see several dark sedans and unmarked vehicles, but no obvious FBI or police markings. No flashing lights, no official insignia that I could detect from my second-floor vantage point. Evelyn, do you see anything that looks like official law enforcement? She joined me at the window, squinting into the darkness. I don't know, dear. On television, FBI agents always wear those jackets with big yellow letters, but these people are just wearing dark clothing. My stomach dropped. What if the text was right? What if the people surrounding my house weren't federal agents at all, but members of the criminal organization David had warned me about? I called Agent Torres back, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried Agent Chen with the same result. Either their phones were turned off for operational security, or something had happened to them. Then I remembered Margaret Sinclair had given me her personal emergency number for situations where you can't trust anyone else. Margaret, it's Natasha. I think I'm in serious trouble. Where are you? At home, but there are people outside claiming to be FBI, and I'm getting conflicting information about whether they're really law enforcement. I explained the phone calls, the texts, the lack of visible official identification. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Natasha, I'm going to call the FBI field office directly and verify what's happening at your location. Do not open your door for anyone until I call you back, regardless of what they claim their authority is. Real federal agents will have no problem waiting for verification of their identity. What if I'm wrong? What if they really are FBI and I'm being paranoid? Then being paranoid will have cost you nothing, but if you're right and you open that door. She didn't finish the sentence. 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Evelyn and I took turns watching the window, but the activity outside had diminished. The vehicles remained, but we could no longer see people moving around. Finally, Margaret called back. Natasha, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Agent Torres and her team are safe and currently conducting operations at multiple locations throughout the city. The bad news is that they're not at your house. The words hit me like ice water. Then who's outside? Unknown parties who are either connected to the criminal organization or are independent actors with their own agenda. Either way, you're not safe. What do I do? There's a federal safe house about 20 minutes from your location. I'm going to give you an address and a contact protocol. Can you get out of your house without being seen? I looked at Evelyn, who was listening to every word with growing alarm. I think so. There's a basement exit that connects to my neighbor's yard. Good. I want you to leave immediately, but first, I need you to do something that might seem strange. Take photos of everyone and every vehicle you can see from your windows. The FBI will need to identify these people. Using my phone's camera, I carefully documented everything visible from my bedroom and living room windows. Dark sedans, unmarked vans, at least 6 individuals in dark clothing who appeared to be maintaining surveillance positions around my property. Margaret, what if this is all some kind of mistake? What if these really are undercover federal agents and I'm about to run from the people trying to protect me? Then you'll apologize later from the safety of a federal facility. But if you're right about this, and you stay, you may not live to apologize for anything. 25 minutes later, Evelyn and I were crouched in my basement, preparing to crawl through the old storm cellar exit that connected to the Johnson property next door. I'd lived in this house for 8 years and never thought I'd need to use my knowledge of its quirky architectural features to escape potential kidnappers. Are you sure about this, dear? Evelyn whispered as I unlocked the cellar door. No, I admitted, but I'm not sure about anything anymore. The only thing I know for certain is that 24 hours ago I thought I knew who I could trust, and I was completely wrong about everything. So now I'm going to trust my instincts instead of other people's words. As we crawled through the narrow passage that would bring us up in the Johnsons' garden shed, I realized that this was what real survival looked like. Not the dramatic confrontations you see in movies, but the careful navigation of a world where everyone claiming to help you might be lying, where official authority could be compromised, and where your only protection was your willingness to trust your own judgment over everyone else's promises. The woman who'd attended that birthday party would have waited in her closet for someone in authority to tell her what to do. The woman crawling through a storm cellar on a cold October night had learned that sometimes the only person you can count on to save you is yourself. The Federal Safe House was a nondescript ranch home in a subdivision 20 minutes outside Millbrook Heights, the kind of place that looked so perfectly ordinary it was practically invisible. Agent Torres met us at the door herself, her relief visible when she saw Evelyn and me climb out of Margaret's car. Mrs. Thornfield Sr., I'm glad you're both safe. We've been monitoring your house since you went dark, and what we found there confirmed our worst suspicions. She led us into a living room that looked like it had been furnished from a discount store catalog. Beige everything, generic artwork, nothing that would stand out in anyone's memory. But the windows were reinforced, and I noticed at least 3 different alarm systems built discreetly into the walls. The people outside your house were part of a private security firm with connections to the Heritage Hill organization, Agent Torres continued. They were posing as federal agents to gain access to you, probably to force you to sign documents retracting your cooperation with our investigation. Or worse, Agent Chen added, appearing from what looked like a kitchen area with coffee and sandwiches. We found zip ties, duct tape, and sedatives in their vehicles when we apprehended them. Evelyn sank into one of the beige chairs, her face gray. They were going to kidnap us? Most likely. The Heritage Hill organization has a pattern of eliminating witnesses when their operations are compromised. They've done it before in Michigan and Ohio. I accepted a cup of coffee, grateful for something to warm my hands which hadn't stopped shaking since we'd crawled out of my basement. What about David and Celeste? Are they really being held hostage, or was that another manipulation? Agent Torres exchanged a look with Agent Chen. We have them both in protective custody. They contacted us voluntarily this afternoon after realizing that their criminal partners were planning to eliminate all loose ends. Voluntary cooperation? Your husband and Ms. Moreau have provided extensive information about the Heritage Hill organization in exchange for reduced sentences. They're looking at significant prison time, but cooperation could reduce David's sentence from 25 years to 8 to 10. 8 to 10 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. Even with cooperation, even with providing evidence against his criminal partners, David would be in federal prison until I was nearly 50 years old. The man I'd married, the life we'd built together, was gone as completely as if he'd died. What about the properties? The forged loans? My credit and financial records? That's where we have good news, Agent Chen said, pulling out a tablet. Because you came forward voluntarily with evidence of the fraud, and because we can prove you were an unwitting victim, the banks are already in the process of removing your name from all fraudulent loan documents. Your credit will be fully restored within 90 days. And the money they stole using my identity? The Heritage Hill organization kept detailed financial records, apparently for tax evasion purposes. We've frozen over $12 million in assets across 7 different accounts. Victims like you will be compensated for damages through asset forfeiture recovery. I stared at them, trying to process what they were telling me. Not only would I not go to prison for crimes I didn't commit, but I would actually receive financial compensation for what had been done to me. How much compensation? Agent Torres consulted her tablet. Based on the damage to your credit, the emotional distress, and the fact that your identity was used to generate approximately $2.3 million in profits, the Victim Compensation Fund will award you $850,000. Evelyn gasped audibly. I felt like I might faint. $850,000? Tax-free, as criminal victim compensation. It won't undo what was done to you, but it should provide financial security while you rebuild your life. I thought about my modest savings account, about the mortgage David and I had been slowly paying down, about the dreams we'd had of buying a bigger house someday. In one devastating weekend, I'd lost my husband and discovered I was the victim of a massive fraud. But I'd also gained enough money to buy any house I wanted, free and clear. What happens to David and Celeste now? They'll remain in protective custody until the trials are complete. The Heritage Hill organization had operatives in 4 states, and trials will probably take 18 to 24 months. After that, assuming they continue to cooperate, David will serve his sentence at a minimum security federal facility. Will I have to see him, testify against him? Not if you don't want to. His guilty plea and cooperation agreement means there won't be a trial for his specific crimes. You may be called as a victim impact witness for the broader Heritage Hill prosecution, but that would be your choice. Agent Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Thornfield, there's something else you should know. The investigation your case triggered has exposed similar operations in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Over 40 families have been victimized by this organization, and most of them had no idea until we contacted them. Your decision to come forward likely saved dozens of people from the same fate you almost suffered. The scope of what I'd inadvertently helped prevent was staggering. 40 families who wouldn't lose their homes, their savings, their freedom, because I'd been brave enough to fight back when I discovered the truth. What about Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who was being targeted? Agent Torres smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. Mrs. Chen is safe. We arrested the people who'd been pressuring her to sell just as they were preparing to make their final offer. She sends her thanks, by the way. She said she knew something felt wrong about those Preservation Society people, but she was afraid no one would believe her. Over the next several hours, agents walked Evelyn and me through the process of victim compensation, witness protection options, and the timeline for returning to our normal lives. The federal investigation would continue for months, but the immediate danger was over. One more question, I said as we prepared to leave the safe house. Celeste's reaction when she saw me at the birthday party. Why did she panic like that? Agent Chen pulled out a file folder. According to her statement, she'd been told that you were a reclusive wife who rarely appeared in public. Her handlers had convinced her that David kept you isolated, and that you were unlikely to attend family gatherings. Seeing you there, confident and social, made her realize that everything she'd been told about your marriage was a lie. Which meant that if they'd lied about you, they'd probably lied about other things too. Like their promises to protect her when the operation ended, or their assurances that victims would never be seriously harmed. Agent Torres closed the file. Seeing you as a real person instead of an abstract target made her realize she was in deeper than she'd understood. As Margaret drove us back toward Millbrook Heights, I stared out the window at the familiar streets that looked different somehow. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I was seeing them through different eyes. The eyes of someone who'd learned that the worst betrayals often come from the people closest to you, but also that you're stronger than you think when survival depends on trusting yourself. What will you do now? Evelyn asked quietly from the back seat. I thought about that question as we passed the Pemberton mansion. The house that had started this whole nightmare, now sitting empty with federal seizure notices on the doors. What would I do with a life that had been completely demolished and rebuilt in the space of 48 hours? I think, I said slowly, I'm going to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone's perfect wife. For the first time since this ordeal began, that felt like the beginning of something good instead of the end of everything I'd known. The woman who'd walked into that birthday party had been living a carefully constructed life built on trust, routine, and the assumption that the people who loved her would never deliberately harm her. The woman driving home from a federal safe house had learned that survival sometimes requires dismantling everything you think you know about your life and rebuilding it from scratch. But she'd also learned that she was capable of things she'd never imagined: investigation, confrontation, escape, and ultimately, justice. As we pulled into my driveway, now free of mysterious vehicles and fake federal agents, I realized that, for the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to choose what came next. No husband to consider, no financial constraints, no obligations except to myself. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The perfect life I'd thought I was living had been an illusion, but the imperfect, uncertain, completely authentic life stretching out ahead of me was entirely my own. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home on Sycamore Hill, watching the sun rise over a view I'd never imagined I could afford. The house was a restored 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and windows that let in more light than I'd seen in years. I had bought it with cash from the Victim Compensation Fund, choosing it not because it was impressive, but because it felt like home the moment I walked through the front door. The coffee maker, a fancy one I'd splurged on because I could, gurgled to life as I opened my laptop to review the final edits on the article I'd been writing for Vanity Fair. The magazine had contacted me 3 months ago, wanting to tell the story of the Heritage Hill fraud scheme and how one woman's discovery at a family gathering had brought down an interstate criminal organization. The birthday party that exposed a criminal empire, the headline would read. I'd insisted on using my real name rather than hiding behind anonymity. The old Natasha would have been mortified at the idea of her private life becoming public. The new Natasha understood that stories like mine helped other women recognize the warning signs before it was too late. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist I'd started seeing after the FBI case closed. Don't forget our session today at 2 p.m. Looking forward to hearing about your weekend plans. Weekend plans. The concept still felt foreign after 15 years of marriage, where every weekend had been structured around David's schedule, his family obligations, his needs. This weekend, I was driving to Portland to visit Caroline, David's sister, who'd reached out after the arrests to apologize for years of treating me like a peripheral family member. I never realized how invisible we made you feel, she'd said during our first phone call. You were always so accommodating, so willing to fade into the background, that we forgot you were a person with your own thoughts and feelings. The realization had been painful, but necessary for both of us. Caroline was now divorced herself, having finally left her emotionally abusive husband after seeing what real courage looked like. We'd found an unexpected friendship in our shared experience of reconstructing our lives from scratch. The morning news was playing softly in the background when a familiar name caught my attention. I turned up the volume to hear the anchor discussing yesterday's sentencing hearing for the Heritage Hill case. Former interior designer Celeste Moreau was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for her role in the multi-state fraud scheme that bilked victims out of over $15 million. Moreau, who authorities say was the operational mastermind behind the Heritage Hill Preservation Society, showed no emotion as the judge read her sentence. 12 years. It seemed both too much and not enough for someone who'd systematically destroyed so many lives. I thought about the other victims I'd met during the trial proceedings. Elderly couples who'd lost their retirement savings, young families forced into bankruptcy, small business owners whose credit was ruined by forged signatures they'd never seen. David's sentencing was scheduled for next month. Based on his cooperation and the testimony he'd provided, prosecutors were recommending 8 years. Sometimes I wondered what I would feel when that gavel fell, when the man I'd loved for 15 years was officially labeled a federal criminal. Mostly, I felt nothing at all. The David I'd married had died the night he introduced Celeste as his real love. The man going to prison was a stranger who'd worn my husband's face while planning my destruction. My doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the peephole, I could see Mrs. Chen standing on my front porch with a covered dish and her characteristic warm smile. She'd become an unexpected friend over the past months, the shared experience of being targeted by the same criminals, creating a bond that transcended our 30-year age difference. "Good morning, dear," she said as I opened the door. "I made too much congee again, and I thought you might like some for breakfast." Mrs. Chen's too much cooking had become a regular occurrence since my divorce was finalized. I suspected she was actually cooking specifically for me, understanding somehow that I was still learning how to take care of myself after years of defining my worth through service to others. "Come in," I said, grateful for the company. I was just reading about Celeste's sentencing. 12 years, Mrs. Chen said, setting the pot on my kitchen counter. My late husband would have said that justice delayed is justice denied, but justice served is still justice. She had a way of putting things in perspective that I appreciated. At 73, she'd survived the Cultural Revolution in China, immigrated to America with nothing, built a successful life, and weathered her husband's death with a grace I envied. The Heritage Hill criminals had targeted her precisely because they'd assumed she was vulnerable and isolated. They'd failed to account for her steel backbone and the network of neighbors who actually paid attention to her welfare. "How are you feeling about the article?" she asked, settling into one of my kitchen chairs. "Nervous, exposed, but also proud, I think." I poured 2 cups of coffee and joined her at the table. "It's strange to see your worst experience turned into something that might help other people." "That's what survivors do," Mrs. Chen said simply. "We turn our pain into purpose so others don't have to suffer the same way." The article would be published next month, time to coincide with David's sentencing. My editor had warned me that it would likely generate significant media attention, possibly including interview requests and speaking opportunities. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. "Have you decided about the book deal?" Mrs. Chen asked. 3 publishers had approached me about expanding the article into a full memoir. The advances they'd offered were substantial enough to ensure I'd never have to worry about money again, even beyond the Victim Compensation Fund. But more than the money, I was intrigued by the possibility of creating something meaningful from the wreckage of my old life. "I think I'm going to do it," I said, "but not just about the fraud. About the whole experience of reconstructing your identity when you realize you've been living someone else's version of your life." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Many women need to hear that story. We're taught to be so accommodating, so selfless, that we forget we're allowed to have preferences and boundaries and dreams that don't revolve around other people's needs." After she left, I spent the morning working in my garden, another new discovery about myself. I'd never gardened during my marriage because David was allergic to most flowers and complained about the time it took away from maintaining our perfect lawn. Now I had raised beds full of vegetables, herb gardens that attracted butterflies, and flower borders that bloomed in succession from spring through fall. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing plants from seeds, about creating beauty with my own hands, about having a space that reflected my choices rather than compromises. The garden was perhaps the most tangible symbol of my new life. Colorful, a little wild, entirely my own. My afternoon therapy session with Dr. Martinez focused on something I'd been avoiding, the fact that I hadn't been on a single date since my divorce was finalized. "I'm not ready," I said, sitting in her comfortable office overlooking the Millbrook River. "I don't think I trust my judgment about men anymore." "That's understandable," she replied, "but I wonder if it's really about trusting your judgment or about trusting yourself to maintain the boundaries you've learned to set." The distinction was important. I had learned to trust my instincts about people's motives and character. The problem was trusting myself to speak up when something felt wrong, to leave when I wasn't being treated well, to choose my own well-being over someone else's comfort. The woman who was married to David would have rationalized red flags and made excuses for problematic behavior, Dr. Martinez continued. "Do you think that woman still exists?" I thought about the question as I drove home through downtown Millbrook Heights. The woman who'd attended David's mother's birthday party would have been devastated by his public betrayal, but probably would have tried to forgive him, to find a way to make the marriage work, despite everything. She would have blamed herself for not being enough to keep him faithful, would have wondered what she could have done differently. That woman was gone as completely as if she'd never existed. The woman driving home now had stood up to federal criminals, rebuilt her life from scratch, and learned to find joy in solitude, rather than defining herself through relationships with others. She'd discovered that she actually preferred her own company to most people's, that she was funnier and smarter and braver than she'd ever had the chance to be when she was trying to be the perfect wife. Maybe someday she'd be ready to share this new life with someone who deserved it. Someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a supporting character in their story. Someone who enhanced her happiness rather than requiring her to diminish herself. But for now, she was perfectly content learning who she was when nobody else's needs took precedence over her own. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a package on my front porch. Inside was an advance copy of the Vanity Fair issue with my article, along with a note from my editor. "Your story is going to help a lot of people. Thank you for being brave enough to share it." I carried the magazine inside and set it on my kitchen counter next to Mrs. Chen's pot of congee. Tomorrow I would probably be nervous about publication, worried about public reaction, anxious about the media attention to come. Tonight I was simply grateful to be alive, free, and completely myself for the first time in my adult life. The woman in the magazine article had survived betrayal, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. But more importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. Because sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the only way to discover what you actually need. 1 year later, I stood in the wings of the TEDx stage at the Millbrook Civic Center, listening to my introduction while trying to calm the butterflies in my stomach. The auditorium was packed with nearly 800 people who'd come to hear me speak about reclaiming your life after betrayal, a journey from victim to victor. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome best-selling author and victim advocate Natasha Carter Thornfield. I'd kept David's name legally, not out of any lingering attachment, but because it connected me to my story in a way that might help other women find my book, my articles, my speaking engagements. Hidden in plain sight, How I Discovered My Husband's Criminal Double Life had been on the New York Times bestseller list for 12 weeks, and the speaking requests were coming in faster than I could accept them. Walking onto that stage, I thought about the woman who'd walked into Evelyn's birthday party 18 months ago. She'd been so careful, so eager to please, so terrified of making waves or drawing unwanted attention. The woman stepping into the spotlight now had learned that sometimes making waves is exactly what the world needs. A year and a half ago, I began looking out at faces that seemed genuinely eager to hear my story. I thought I knew what my life was about. I was the good wife, the reliable daughter-in-law, the woman who kept everyone else's secrets and never asked uncomfortable questions. I was proud of how smoothly I kept everything running, how little drama I caused, how invisible I could make myself when necessary. The audience was completely silent, leaning forward in their seats. In the front row, I could see Mrs. Chen beaming with pride, Caroline nodding encouragingly, and Margaret Sinclair, who'd become both my lawyer and my friend, smiling broadly. But what I learned that night is that being invisible doesn't protect you from other people's choices. It doesn't shield you from their crimes. It just makes you an easier target when they need someone to blame. I told them about David's introduction of Celeste, about her terrified flight from the room, about my long night of discovery. I shared the financial details, the forged signatures, the elaborate criminal conspiracy that had used my identity as camouflage for federal crimes. The question I get asked most often is how I didn't know. How could I live with someone for 15 years and not realize he was committing federal crimes using my identity? I paused, letting that question hang in the air. And the answer is, because I was trained not to know. This was the part of my story that resonated most powerfully with other women. The recognition that many of us are socialized to ignore our instincts, to trust others' explanations over our own observations, to prioritize harmony over truth, We're taught that being a good wife means not asking too many questions, not demanding too much transparency, not making our partners uncomfortable with our curiosity about their lives. We're told that trust means accepting what we're told without verification, that love means giving people the benefit of the doubt even when the doubt keeps growing. I talked about the red flags I'd explained away, the inconsistencies I'd ignored, the gradual erosion of my financial independence and decision-making authority that had happened so slowly I'd barely noticed. But here's what I want you to understand. Being victimized by someone you trust doesn't make you stupid or naive. It makes you human. The people who exploit our trust are counting on our basic human decency, our assumption that the people who claim to love us wouldn't deliberately harm us. The audience was completely engaged now, many people nodding in recognition, some wiping away tears. In the question period after my talk, woman after woman would approach the microphone to share their own stories of financial betrayal, hidden affairs, emotional manipulation disguised as love. But this story isn't really about betrayal, I continued. It's about what comes after betrayal. It's about the moment you realize that the life you thought you were living was actually a performance for an audience that never cared about your well-being. And it's about what happens when you decide to stop performing and start living. I shared the practical steps I'd taken, consulting the lawyer, gathering evidence, cooperating with federal authorities. But more importantly, I talked about the internal work, learning to trust my own judgment, setting boundaries, discovering who I was when I wasn't trying to be who someone else needed me to be. The woman who attended that birthday party was living a carefully curated life designed to meet other people's expectations. She had opinions about what kind of coffee to serve guests, but no idea what her favorite coffee was. She knew exactly how to fold fitted sheets the way her mother-in-law preferred, but couldn't remember the last time she'd read a book just because she wanted to. This drew knowing laughter from the audience, the recognition of women who'd lost themselves in the endless accommodation of other people's preferences. Recovery from betrayal isn't just about healing from what was done to you. It's about discovering what you actually want from life when no one else's needs are taking precedence over yours. It's about learning that your comfort, your safety, your dreams matter just as much as anyone else's. I told them about buying my house, about the garden that bloomed according to my taste rather than someone else's allergies, about choosing furniture that I loved rather than what looked impressive to visitors, about the friends I'd made who knew me as Natasha, not as David's wife or any one supporting character. The most surprising thing about rebuilding my life, I said, was discovering that I actually liked my own company, that I was funnier, smarter, and braver than I'd ever had the chance to be when I was focused on being the perfect wife. I talked about the book, about the victim compensation that had given me financial freedom, about the criminal justice outcomes that had validated my choice to fight back. But mostly, I talked about the peace of living an authentic life. Last month, I ran into David's brother Thomas at the grocery store. He asked me if I missed being married, if I was lonely, if I regretted destroying his family. I smiled at the memory. And I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was just free. The audience was completely silent, waiting for my conclusion. I told Thomas that I didn't destroy his family. His family was already destroyed by lies, by crimes, by the decision to sacrifice one member's well-being for another's greed. I just stopped pretending it was healthy. I took a breath, looking out at hundreds of faces that seemed to understand exactly what I meant. The woman who walked into that birthday party was living someone else's version of her life. She was accommodating, invisible, grateful for whatever scraps of attention and affection she received. She believed that her value came from her usefulness to others, that her worth was measured by how little trouble she caused. Another pause, letting the words sink in. The woman standing before you today has learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the permission to disappoint people who never had your best interests at heart. That sometimes walking away from everything you thought you wanted is the only way to discover what you actually need. The applause was thunderous, sustained, transformative. As I walked off that stage, I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been: the naive newlywed, the accommodating wife, the unknowing victim, the determined investigator, the federal witness, the survivor, the author, the advocate. Each version had been necessary, had taught me something essential about resilience, about justice, about the difference between being loved and being used. But this version, the woman who could stand in front of 800 strangers and tell the truth about the worst and best thing that had ever happened to her, this was the version I was most proud of. After the event, at the reception where people lined up to share their own stories and ask for advice, Mrs. Chen appeared at my elbow with a plate of cookies and her characteristic wisdom. "You know," she said, watching the crowd of women eager to connect, "I think that birthday party was the best thing that ever happened to you." I looked around at the faces of women who'd driven hours to hear me speak, who'd bought my book, who'd found courage in my story to examine their own lives. Women who were asking themselves for the first time in years what they actually wanted, what they actually needed, what they actually deserved. "You're right," I said. "It was the worst night of my life, and it was also the night my real life began." Sometimes the most devastating betrayal turns out to be the most liberating gift you'll ever receive. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is the only way to discover the strength you never knew you had. Sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a much better one. And sometimes walking away from the person you thought you were is the first step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. The woman who'd attended that birthday party had been living a carefully constructed lie. The woman driving home from the Civic Center that night was living a truth so authentic it could inspire hundreds of others to seek their own freedom. That, I realized, was the real victory, not just surviving betrayal but transforming it into a force for good in the world. As I pulled into my driveway past the garden that bloomed with my favorite flowers toward the house I'd chosen because it felt like home, I whispered the words that had become my daily affirmation. "I am not who I was when I was trying to be who you needed me to be. I am who I choose to be when I'm accountable only to myself." And for the first time in my life, that person was exactly who I wanted to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.